Hey, Charlie Pyatt here. In the last episode, I mocked up the headset and came away pretty happy with the proportions of everything. So this episode is going to be a little different. I want to talk about the future of industrial design and manufacturing. And to talk about the future, we have to go over where we are today. I'm going to go over the basics of injection molding, 3D printing, and 3D scanning, as well as how those technologies can come together to make a mass-produced product. This is going to be a longer episode that covers that stuff and gets into how you can leverage all those technologies to make something different. I do want to say up front that all the topics I'm about to talk about are very complicated. Even if I spent hours talking about these subjects, I would still just be scratching the surface. For now, I'm just going to try and give the most general overviews and try not to get bogged down in too much detail. So yeah, let's get to it. When talking about how consumer products get made, you have to talk about injection molding. This mouse, keyboard, phone case, and headphones that just happen to be in front of me were all mass-produced by using injection molding. The basic concept of injection molding is pretty straightforward. A cavity is machined out of metal to create a mold called the tooling. This mold set comes together and is injected with heated plastic under a huge amount of pressure, filling the mold. The mold separates, ejector pins fire, and the part is released, then the process repeats. This process is very efficient at creating a large quantity of high-quality and identical parts. Injection molding comes with some specific constraints though. In general, you can't have undercuts with an injected molded part. If you do, the mold will not be able to separate and you wouldn't be able to get the part out of the mold. The way around this is to make a more complex mold or to separate your single part into smaller subparts that will need to be assembled later. This is where we start getting into the cost side of injection molding. The more complex the mold, the more costly it'll be to make, and adding additional mold features can get very expensive very quickly. The advantage of all this is that after the expensive tooling is made, it will cost pennies to make each plastic part. So from here I could go into more details on tooling like draft angles, sprue placement, and connection features for mold making, but those topics all get into more detail than I want to cover in this video. Instead I want to switch over to the other end of the manufacturing spectrum and talk about 3D printing. When most people hear about 3D printing, they think of home and hobbyist printers, but there is a whole world of technology in this space that has changed the way consumer products are created. 3D printing comes off as almost magic at first. You have a digital 3D model on your computer and then you send it over to your 3D printer. You get your parts made into reality with no expensive molds or custom setups. If you wade into the details though, you can demystify how it all works. There are a bunch of different methods for printing plastic parts that range from $100 desktop machines to $1 million or more industrial systems. While all these machines use a different technology, at the highest level they all work the same. A digital 3D model on your computer is sliced into layers. Those layers are sent over to the 3D printer, then built up on top of each other until you have a completed physical object. The thickness of each layer is the Z-height resolution or step height of your 3D print. Different printers have different print resolutions and can use different materials, but at the end of the day, this is how they all work. Where the topic of 3D printers gets more complex is when we start talking about the exact process or method that is used to do the stacking and material buildup. You can put all plastic 3D printers into three different categories: filament printers, resin printers, and powder-based printers. Filament printers are the most common 3D printing machines and are what most people have at home or in their shop for personal use. These printers use a process called fused deposition modeling, or FDM. FDM machines print using a spool of plastic wire or filament that is fed into a heated print head. This print head essentially draws in each 2D layer to build up a part. FDM machines have a lot of benefits. They are very inexpensive machines to produce and maintain. They can also have large build volumes, which means they can create larger parts for significantly less cost. FDM machines are also relatively clean and safe to run. The other great thing about these machines is that there is a very large community of DIY enthusiasts that use them, so there's a lot of knowledge floating around out there on best ways to print using this process. FDM machines do have some drawbacks though. They have a comparatively slow print time, so getting a finished part can take a while. The print process is also mechanical in nature, so there's a limit to the Z-resolution or step height you can get out of an FDM machine. They're also generally more failure prone than the other 3D printing types. This is where a layer can detach during printing, requiring the whole process to start over. FDM machines also require supports for overhangs, where material has to be built up in order to hold a floating part. This method of printing is not a great choice if the part needs to be watertight, food safe, or for medical use. The filament naturally creates microscopic gaps as the part is created that can allow water in over time. This can be prevented by sealing the part with a coating after the printing is done, but again, this requires additional steps. The final issue with FDM prints is that they are non-isotropic, which is a fancy way of saying they have different mechanical properties if you apply force on them from different directions. So if you pull on an FDM part in this direction, it will be much stronger than if you compress it on that same axis. Same from the top, if you compress the part, it will be stronger than if you pull on it. This isn't a big deal for many applications, but if you need precise and predictable mechanical properties for a bracket or mount, it can be an issue. Right, so that covers the basics of filament or FDM printing. The next process to talk about is resin printing. Resin printing uses ultraviolet light to solidify liquid resin that is held in a tank or tub to build up a part. The build platform moves up, liquid resin flows in, and the layer is solidified by exposing it to UV light. The process repeats until you have your finished part. There are several different ways this class of printer can use to control the UV light exposure. The oldest method is called stereolithography, or SLA. With SLA printers, the UV light is in the form of a laser that flickers across the part to harden each layer. Another method is digital light projection, or DLP. DLP printers just have an LCD display that illuminates an entire layer at a time. Resin printers have a lot of great aspects. They can print at some of the highest resolutions of any class of 3D printer. These machines have also come down in price significantly in the past decade. Hobbyist DLP printers can be found for a few $100s, with prosumer SLA printers being a few thousand. This means that the final price of individual parts has plummeted since the early 2000s. The chemistry has also come a long way in the resins these printers use, making it so the machines can output parts with a range of materials from solids to rubbery elastomers. These prints are also naturally watertight and can be printed with medical grade materials. Print reliability is also very high with these machines. Even if there is some unexpected defect in a print layer, parts can often continue to print successfully. Because these resins are bonding layers at the molecular level, they make isotropic parts with very uniform mechanical properties. With all those pros, resin printers do come with a number of downsides. Scaling the build volume up for larger parts can get very expensive with resin printing. There are resin printers out there that can create parts over 5 feet, but these are heavy industrial machines that are incredibly expensive to run. Resin printers are also fairly messy to operate. This makes these printers less attractive for use in educational settings with kids or in shared shop spaces without dedicated cleaning areas. Because resin printers use UV light to cure, they are not well suited for parts that will be outside or exposed to daylight. Parts will continue to cure in the sunlight, causing them to become brittle and can yellow over time as well. Similar to FDM prints, resin prints require supports to build parts that have overhangs. Finally, resin printers require post-cleaning and may need additional curing in a UV light box. This takes additional hardware, manual work time, and space that adds to the cost of these prints. The final class of 3D printers to talk about are the powder-based machines. A common build method used on these machines is selective laser sintering, or SLS. SLS machines work by using a plastic that has been ground into fine particles or a powder-like consistency. This plastic powder is rolled out over the print bed, smoothed down, and bonded together with a heat source, essentially melting the plastic particles together to make a layer. At the end of the process, the parts are pulled out of the loose sand bed in their finished form. Powder-based machines allow for some really interesting parts that can only be done on this class of printer. Because the parts are suspended in the sand bed, they do not need supports. This lets designers do some interesting tricks. As an example, I made this computer mouse many years ago that has 18 separate parts that are connected by hinge mechanisms designed into the print. This came off the machine completely working like this with no assembly needed. I also did this cell phone VR display that can collapse down. This was printed all in a single pass with all the interconnected moving hinges already assembled right off the print bed as well. The other advantage of having SLS parts floating in the print bed during printing is that the build space can be filled much more efficiently than on filament or resin printers. It makes bulk printing of parts much faster and cost-effective. Each layer of an SLS part is physically bonded together with focused heat from a laser, making for a very uniform and mechanically strong plastic part. Because this is a thermal bonding process, not curing from UV light exposure, SLS prints can work better for outdoor use. With all this, powder-based machines do have some cons. The resolution of this class of printer is excellent, but the finished parts can have a rough texture, almost like a sand-cast metal part. This requires additional steps to get these parts to a smooth finish. For a number of reasons, these printers also tend to have smaller build volumes. Even the largest and most expensive industrial machines of this class have limited maximum part sizes when compared to resin and filament type machines. Although there have been some advancements into the prosumer market in the last few years, Powder bed machines are really more of an industrial process. The fine powder the parts are made of can be extremely messy to handle and require additional safety measures, such as wearing a respirator. Added to this, powder-based machines are usually some of the most expensive machines on the market. A low-cost sintering machine can cost well over $20,000, with larger industrial versions being in the high six figures area. So that, really broadly at least, covers how 3D printers work and the options that are out there today. I also don't want to scare anyone away by talking about the price of these industrial machines. There are a bunch of online print houses where you can upload your model and have it printed and mailed back to you in a few business days. Places like Shapeways, Stratasys, Sculpteo, and Fathom all make getting parts created more accessible than ever before. You can model out a hand-sized part that is printed on a six-figure machine for tens of dollars in some cases, which is pretty amazing. So we've covered mass production and 3D printing, but now I wanted to talk about how those technologies are used today and the future of industrial design. 3D printing has come down in price dramatically, but at the end of the day, injection molded parts will always be cheaper than 3D printed parts for production. Even if I can cut printing costs down on a project to say $10 each, that will never beat the $1 or less per part I can get with injection molding, even taking into account the cost of tooling. This has left 3D printing used only when a design would be impossible to manufacture through injection molding or for production prototyping. But this is where I think the future of consumer products is going to get really interesting. Printing technology doesn't need to make the same exact copies of the same product. So what if, instead of trying to make the exact copies of the same object as cheaply as possible, you make a system that can generate a custom product for each person? What if you don't try and compete by lowering the cost, but instead increase the value of the finished part by making it unique? If you flip the concept of mass production on its head like this, suddenly the possibilities start getting much more interesting for 3D printing for production. Instead of trying to make the production cost lower, you're making the product more valuable. That's part of what I'm planning to do with this project. If you remember back to the first episode, the face gasket for the VR headset design is going to be custom generated to fit me exactly. I'm going to make a software system that can take in scan data of anyone's face and generate a custom mask geometry that can only be manufactured using 3D printing. The exact details of how I'm going to do this are going to get complicated, so I'm going to dedicate the entire next episode to covering it. But because the custom product generation system is going to be driven by a 3D scan of my face, I wanted to spend some time going over 3D scanning technology as well. The most basic goal of 3D scanning is to get a physical object that exists in reality converted into a digital object on your computer. 3D scanning techniques can be broken down into three major categories: image analysis, structured light, and time of flight. One of the most common image-based scanning techniques is photogrammetry. With photogrammetry, a bunch of still images are taken of an object with a normal camera. No special hardware is required. You then bring the images into the photogrammetry software, which triangulates where the camera is relative to the object that was photographed. When all these triangulated camera positions are calculated together, a 3D mesh can be generated that captures the scene. As an example, I did this scene using Meshroom, which is a free open source photogrammetry software. Photogrammetry is pretty amazing. It's basically free and has no real hardware requirements to get 3D objects out of reality and into your computer. Photogrammetry does have some downsides though. The biggest one is a lack of scale. If you scan a 1-inch cube with photogrammetry, it may come out the size of a house or the size of a grain of sand. And there's really no immediate way to determine the actual size of something with photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is also very time intensive to calculate. A complete image set might consist of hundreds of images that need to be processed, which can take hours to complete for a single scan. This technology is also very light sensitive. If an area of an object is completely in shadow, there's no way for the software to determine what details exist there in 3D space. There's also a common problem in many of the scanning methods we're going to talk about with objects that have limited surface details. Photogrammetry really struggles with low detail or smooth objects. The next type of 3D scanning to talk about is structured light systems. These scanners work by projecting a known pattern of light onto an object, then analyzing the pattern from a fixed angle to determine what the object looks like. Some scanners use infrared or IR light, some use red laser, and others use blue laser for projection. The general concept of all structured light systems are the same though. They throw a pattern out and then analyze it to determine where an object is in 3D space. These systems are much faster than photogrammetry at generating scan data at a higher level of accuracy. These methods have their drawbacks. Much like photogrammetry, structured light scanning really struggles with clear and shiny objects. Structured light also has a focal length. If the scan is too close to the object, then the projected pattern can't spread out enough to be analyzed. Likewise, if the object being scanned is too far away, then the pattern is too dim or spread out to be processed. Structured light systems also require special hardware for scanning. That being said, you may have one of these systems in your phone already that you can do pretty good resolution capturing with. The final class of 3D scanners to talk about is time-of-flight systems, or TOFs. These scanners include LiDAR scanners, which stands for light detection and ranging. Time-of-flight systems are very difficult to show in real time, but they essentially emit a pulse of light and record the time and strength that the signal returns at. Sonar and radar are other technologies that use this concept to generate a view of the world, but use sound and radio signal reflection instead of light. Time-of-flight systems are also different in that they don't really have a focal length exactly. The distance and resolution they can see is a product of the amount of energy their signal emits and the size and sensitivity of their sensor. A very powerful LiDAR system can see the ground from an aircraft or even from space to create topology data maps. Because time-of-flight systems use light ranging for scanning, they're extremely fast at acquiring data. They can also work better at getting scan data off reflective surfaces and in variable lighting conditions. The sacrifice of TOFs is that the resolution and detail you can get out of the system is, very generally speaking, less than found in other scanning options. As a result, they're less suited for detailed scanning of small objects or for reverse engineering. So that covers my high-speed tour of the world of 3D scanning. What's really amazing about this stuff is that you may already own a thing that can do most of these techniques. If your cell phone has a camera on it, it can do photogrammetry. If you have an iPhone from 2017 or later that unlocks by looking at it, you own a structured light scanner. And some of the iPhones from 2020 on have time-of-flight sensors. That means that a small brick that fits in your pocket and was never meant to do 3D scanning in the first place can do all the types of 3D scanning we talked about. It's kind of crazy. So I have a device that can do 3D scans and the technology to print custom products. My custom VR headset needs a scan of my face, so I'm just going to use the phone in my pocket and scan myself. Next episode, I'm going to get into using the scan data in a software solution to make an automated mass personalized product. Hope you enjoyed and see you next time.